Hello, and welcome to the next installment of the Cure Parkinson's and Journal of Parkinson's Disease webinar. My name is Tilo Kunath from the University of Edinburgh. And today we have a very special webinar focusing on World Parkinson's Congress that was in Barcelona in early July. This is the only meeting that brings together scientists, researchers, people living with Parkinson's, loved ones, clinicians, healthcare professionals. It's a great smorgasbord of people all looking at solving the problem of Parkinson's. It's a meeting where people with Parkinson's have the opportunity to present posters, books, lead talks, sessions, share ideas, advice. This is where international collaborations and friendships are forged. So today we have four brilliant panelists to give us their impressions and their thoughts and their motivations from this Congress. We have Richelle Flanaghan, Andrew Shai, Marie-Louise Zeisler, and Jody Forbes. So they're going to introduce themselves briefly, and then they're going to give us their personal impressions of the conference, and then we'll go into some Q&A. So if you have any questions that appear, that come up during the webinar, please put them into the Q&A box, and then we'll try to get them in the second half of the webinar. But first, I'll let Rochelle take it away.
Hi there, my name is Rochelle Flanagan. I am a dietitian based in Dublin, Ireland. I was diagnosed with young onset Parkinson's disease shortly after the birth of my daughter. I attended WPC Kyoto and applied to become a WPC ambassador for Barcelona, which I just attended, and delighted to be here to share my experience of the most recent WPC. Thank you.
Hi there, I'm Andrew Shai. I'm a final year PhD student in Kunath's lab, and I am studying alpha-synuclein in the protein, how it could have healthy functions and whether it relates to forms that we see in Lewy bodies. And this was actually my first World Parkinson's Conference I ever went to, and it was really cool and incredibly enriching experience for me, especially as an early career researcher.
Hi, my name is Marie Sassa, and I'm a research fellow at the University of Plymouth in the UK. And I support the Edmund J. Safra ACPD initiative, which is developing a large UK-based multi-centre platform trial for Parkinson's. And this was also my first time attending the WPC, and I thought it was a really fantastic conference to kind of see patient engagement and research at its best.
And I'm Jody Forbes. I'm based in London in the UK. A bit like Rochelle, I wear a couple of hats. So first of all, I have Parkinson's. I was diagnosed in 2017 at the age of 47, had symptoms from about age 45. But the other hat I wear is I do bits of work for various organisations and charities related to Parkinson's. So I do data analysis. I do a bit of work from the Michael J. Fox Foundation for ACTPD that Marie works with, and also for Cure Parkinson's.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, now we're going to go into a deep dive into how each of you experienced WPC. What were your highlights? What were your motivations? So please take it away, Rochelle.
Okay, so for me, I'm just going to set my timer to keep me on track. Yeah, I mean, oh gosh, where to start? I suppose a big motivation for me was the original Congress I went to in Kyoto. And I noticed there that there was a lack of focus on diet, and I was really looking forward to seeing a lot about diet and Parkinson's. And there was a bit, but not as much as I thought as a dietitian doing some research into Parkinson's that there needed to be. So it was great to see at this Congress a lot more focus on nutrition and diet for Parkinson's. So there was a session on the ins and outs of food and nutrition, which was really fantastic. It kind of went from looking at swallowing issues in Parkinson's, which I think is a totally under sort of focused area with people with Parkinson's. From my own experience, people would say that I don't seem to suffer much in terms of Parkinson's symptoms, but I actually have mild dysphagia, which was recognised through a a swallow scope test. So that was really important. That came up in this WPC. Also, there was a neurologist who spoke, Silke Appel-Creswell, on best options for nutrition and Parkinson's, and really corroborated a lot of the evidence with regard to the Mediterranean diet and how important it is for this information to get to people with Parkinson's. And then it was nicely finished off by a session by a Parkinson's disease nurse about constipation and Parkinson's, and very practical. Constipation is one of the biggest non-motor symptoms that affects quality of life with people with Parkinson's. So that was really great. Also, I was delighted that when I went to WPC in Kyoto, there was no networking session for dietitians, but this year we actually had one. It was the first time ever at WPC. So we had 10 to 12 dietitians and nutritionists, and we have basically outputs from that we're going to produce a paper to help drive forward awareness amongst dietitians about the importance of nutrition for people with Parkinson's. On a personal level, I actually delivered a session about young onset Parkinson's nutrition, and there was a gentleman called John Ball, who actually, he's written a book. I'm just going to hold it up here. It's called Living Well with PD. He's now in his early 80s and he was diagnosed when he was in his 30s. He's lived with it for 50 years, and he's run 20 plus marathons. So I asked him to come into my session and actually share about how he managed in terms of diet and the importance of carbohydrate, because a lot of people are, trying to follow all sorts of weird and wonderful diets. So he shared with the audience how important carbohydrates were in terms of doing this marathon running. And it was just a really powerful testimony that you can live with Parkinson's well for a long time once you look at your diet and your exercise and lifestyle. So that was a really big thing for me as well. In terms of the other sort of key areas was with regard to women. So Sonia Mather did a hot topics presentation on the comprehensive survey data set of women with Parkinson's by women with Parkinson's. And that was really a standout one for me, showing that basically she presented results of an MJ Fox survey that we put together that showed that women reported who are still menstruating reported that 44% of them reported that the medication didn't work as well the week before their period and the week during their period. 30% said the medication didn't work during their period. So that has big implications in terms of management, and also in terms of her presentation, she also highlighted that two-thirds reported the healthcare team did not adjust their medications in response to these changes, and 90% said they didn't suggest any kind of change in management based on their hormonal status. And another thing that I thought was really interesting as well was the comparison between women who are premenstrual around their symptoms. So it showed that women around the menstrual cycle off time was one of their top sort of motor symptoms, then tremor, stiffness, bradykinesia. But women who are postmenopausal, the off time didn't come into it at all. So just kind of wonder, is it the hormones that are having that big impact in terms of fluctuations for women? And also postmenopausal women had a much more focus on urinary loss or urinary incontinence, loss of smell, constipation and pain, which interestingly kind of probably reflect more of the men's symptoms, which may be because obviously women have lost estrogen protective factors. So I think there's a lot that, kind of came out from that hot topic session. And really, I suppose a core thing that she sort of said was that, there's a need for more research focusing on, sex and gender needs. The trials need to be inclusive of women's genetics, hormones, and drug metabolism. And we need more gender sensitive markers, biomarkers, and social markers, because there are gender markers that we need to take into account in terms of stigma, etc. So that was a really big one. I suppose on a personal level, also meeting all the amazing women. So there seemed to be a lot more women with Parkinson's at this Congress. There was my co-founders, the Women's Parkinson's Project, who we had worked together for 4 years since the last one and never actually met physically. So that was amazing. Also, all the amazing women who worked on the MJ Fox survey. And also, there was the launch of the In Her Shoes book, which was targeted at young onset women, talking about all the different issues that young onset women have to deal with Parkinson's. So you can get that on yopdwomen.com. And it's now translated into Spanish, and it's going to be translated into other languages as well. So that was a really big thing. And then also, I suppose, in terms of personally, we had a lot of posters. We did posters in terms of from the Women's Parkinson's Project. We did several about the needs of women. And I suppose in terms of other research sessions, I suppose two things that stood out for me were tracking disease progression, which is a session, and in particular, Sarah Regari, her presentation as a person with Parkinson's and tracking and sort of saying that the importance of people to actually, to use your own observations to answer your own questions, and you can build your own agency and knowledge, and that people with Parkinson's need to track to improve their own self-care and have a structured approach that helps. And you can start with pen and paper. But I suppose I have a personal interest in this because I have developed an app called Mind Moves Matter for people with Parkinson's, because I really believe as a dietitian that we need to be empowering people with Parkinson's to live better with the condition. And then lastly, I suppose one of the sort of scientific sessions that I also saw was on a drug called NLX-112, which was a drug that is in a trial at the moment. And I'm just going to finish up on what that said. I'm just trying to remember here. Sorry, I'm just going to, yeah. So basically it was on phase 2A, and it showed that basically it reduced Parkinson's dyskinesias, and also, seemed to kind of have perhaps disease modifying, I don't know, but I was very excited about this product, the NLX-112. So I'm really excited to see how their next phases go. So they were some of my highlights. Sorry, that was a whistle-stop tour.
No, it was brilliant. Thank you, Richelle. No, the importance of diet was absolutely a huge part of this Congress. Gender was also really big. So Sonia Mather's talk that I went to as well was absolutely inspirational. Andrew, I'll let you have your chance now.
So as was my first conference, I didn't really know what to expect from the WPC, and it was obviously hugely enriching in terms of its diversity. And I think that really fed back to sort of the scientific side of what I do and the research. So I primarily went to a lot of scientific talks as a researcher myself, and I look at alpha-synuclein, how that the protein could be healthy and also how it performs disease functions. So I looked at one specific talk, which was it was set out as a debate, and it was the learning from the complex nature of Lewy bodies. And so for people who don't know as much, so alpha-synuclein, it's obviously a protein that we know a lot about in what it does in Parkinson's disease and dementia of Lewy bodies. And it's highly abundant in these neurotoxic Lewy body structures. And what I sort of have gone through in my research is that it's what's highlighted in the clinical and the patient experiences is that the PD and DLB can be very highly heterogeneous in terms of its symptoms, its onset, and evidently the outcome and the experiences that people go through. And it was interesting to see whether this sort of complexity and heterogeneity does translate into fundamental disease modeling that we go through in the lab. So whilst looking at the Lewy body disease subjects, there were two really well-renowned professors who were chairing this debate, which is actually quite a unique setup for the WPC. One of them was Professor Wilma van den Berg. She was at Amsterdam UMC, as well as Professor Hillel Lashwell, who was actually at the previous webinar. He's an associate professor in Lausanne. And it was interesting because it was set up as a debate that I actually found what they agreed on actually to be the more interesting, the actually really interesting, surprising stuff that came out for me. So what Professor van den Berg very much highlighted, which I found really surprising as well, was that we do know that alpha-synuclein as a protein, it does have potential different forms that it can have in terms of its structure. So it can be longer, it can be shorter with bits chopped off the end of it. And it can also have chemical groups attached to it, which can be add different properties into how the protein interacts, such as phosphates and nitrates. And we call these post-translational modifications. But what was really interesting from her research was that we shouldn't really consider alpha-synuclein in different synucleinopathies, such as MSA and PD and dementia of Lewy bodies, as just one protein. And or more specifically, the difference of levels of the protein in the different diseases, but actually there were different forms of alpha-synuclein, such as shorter versions of alpha-synuclein that actually appeared more abundantly in diseases in MSA as opposed to in Parkinson's disease dementia. And we shouldn't really be seeing alpha-synuclein as just one protein target, but actually as almost like a spectrum. And that was interesting because Hilal Ashwell also agreed on that notion that alpha-synuclein can be very heterogeneous. And that was really enriching for me as a scientist because as he considers alpha-synuclein as highly heterogeneous in terms of its structure, that can affect the way that as scientists we detect alpha-synuclein when we study it in the labs, but also feeding back into clinical settings, or whether we should be looking at different forms of alpha-synuclein or considering alpha-synuclein as different components in patient monitoring, etc. And I think also actually seeing the people talk, you don't get these things within a paper as much. And it's actually really enriching to have this sort of little debates, little snippets of information that actually really enrich the research, and actually talking to the person up front is just really good. But they also, the stuff that they wouldn't say disagreed on, but what they had differing views on was also really exciting because they showed really interesting fundamental research. The debate that Professor Vandenberg was citing was that Lewy bodies are much more than just blocks of alpha-synuclein aggregates, and that is specifically means that it's not just alpha-synuclein and blocks of alpha-synuclein that just drives the pathology in the same way as each other, if you look at different patients and different Lewy bodies. And what was interesting is that she showed really interesting immunostaining data that showed that different alpha-synuclein forms could actually layer and make up a Lewy body in terms of you have different structures or even shorter forms of alpha-synuclein that are maybe around the outside and maybe different forms within the center, but also that the Lewy bodies also contain multiple organelles as well as other proteins that are specifically enriched in these Lewy bodies. And that means that you just sort of add this huge amount of complexity that we don't really consider before. And that potentially maybe explains this wide spectrum of clinical symptoms that we see in the clinic. What Hilal Ashwell was debating actually was that Lewy bodies actually were more of the major driver of neurodegeneration, but we should be looking at alpha-synuclein more specifically in that different changes of alpha-synuclein, so these post-translational modifications can lead to different properties, can actually sort of enrich, can actually sort of change the environment that alpha-synuclein interacts. And that was really exciting because you don't really get these information from reading papers. And for me, as an early career researcher, you really get the sense that you have a lot of the small little snippets of information, as well as getting to know the patients and the patient advocates and seeing their experiences. It really sort of gave me a huge amount of appreciation for the diversity of the clinical settings, the clinical experiences, and how from when I do my own research, when I have my own experiments that I think about, that I shouldn't consider alpha-synuclein as specifically one protein or one form that does one thing, but actually it's a multitude of different conclusions I can make from it.
So has it informed your research? Did you do anything different coming back from WPC?
Yeah, so of course, I think the main thing was that obviously that we showed that alpha-synuclein, sometimes you can consider alpha-synuclein as just one protein that isn't as complex as it is. And I think coming back from WPC, I saw really am looking more specifically into how maybe some like heterogeneous results that I get actually is part of the conclusion, and as opposed to just maybe not disregarding it as experimental noise, for example, but actually how would you say appreciating the complexity actually is part of the disease and is part of the disease modeling that I'm studying.
Brilliant, thank you. let's move to Marie now. Let's hear your experiences and impressions.
So for me, this was also my first time at WPC, and because I'm working on the ACPD initiative, which is looking to launch a large trial, actually sort of this interaction between research and patients was really interesting. And so I think I want to tell you about 3 things that really sort of stood out to me at this Congress, so sort of presentations and sort of resources that I found and that could be really helpful also in terms of communicating, but also maybe in terms of engaging sort of ethnically diverse people with Parkinson's in research. And so one talk that I really enjoyed was from Emma Lane, which was actually in the Clinical Research Village. She co-presented with someone with Parkinson's called Vicky Dillon. And Emma Lane is based at the University of Cardiff, and she was presenting on the Learn Initiative, which is basically exploring participant experience in trials. And so the lady she co-presented with actually took part in the GDNF trial, and this is where they, from which they which they based their study, and they created as a result of this a phenomenal amount of resources which can be really, really useful to researchers in communicating clinical trials. Some of them are videos. And then there's also a participant checklist that can be used by participants and their families to ask questions. And this is something that really resonated also with our patient engagement group, because how can you ask questions about something that you don't really know much about, that you might be interested in but don't really know, and that's actually, you know, really putting yourself out there in terms of taking part in something that might actually sound quite scary, perhaps. And so I think this is really good, and it's also really good for researchers, I think, as a tool to look at what sort of questions you should think about when preparing your communications about trials and research. So that's kind of why I wanted to highlight this fantastic resource that's available for people to look at. The other thing that I really, really liked was actually the roundtables, and I never actually experienced anything quite like it. You could basically go and speak to experts and sign up, you know, who would basically facilitate a discussion, and you could share experience with others who came to the same roundtable and who were interested in that particular topic. And I attended one led by Richard Gordon about how people with Parkinson's can participate as consumer advisors in Parkinson's research programs. And that discussion was really interesting. I guess I was probably one of the people who pulled the discussion off track, just to say. But there was this lady called Sarah Muir, I hope I pronounced that correctly, from the University of Dundee, and she attended the roundtable, and she basically presented these cards, which are sort of artists' impressions of different aspects of research, and I thought that was really, really interesting. It's called Parkinson's Exchanges, and you can use this in any setting. It doesn't have, you know, any language associated with it because it's just pictures, so you could use it in diverse communities just to start a conversation about research. So I thought that was really actually quite amazing, and you know, you could modify those or add pictures that are more relevant to your research. I thought that entire concept was fantastic. And in terms of my favorite talk, that was actually a plenary session, a plenary talk by Georgina Aldridge from the University of Iowa, and it was about the role of alpha-synuclein co-pathology in cognitive and non-motor symptoms. And the reason why I really liked this talk, apart from the science that was also interesting, was that she actually told the story of a patient in her clinic and how she started investigating his symptoms, and then he donated his brain, and she was able to investigate co-pathology based on this incredibly generous gift. And I thought that really showcases how people with Parkinson's are central and really important to forming research questions, and how the gift by someone can really lay the foundations to help many more with the condition. And I just thought it was actually really inspiring. And so I think in conclusion, I can say that that the WPC really is a masterclass in how you engage with patients. And I really actually enjoyed that that a lot of the talks where they conveyed the important science, so it was interesting to scientists, but also they were sort of created in a very engaging way. And so even if you didn't know, so for example, something that you don't really know about, it's not your field of research, you could go into a talk and you could actually grasp what they were talking about. And I really like that. So yeah, those were my impressions.
Brilliant. Yeah, these Parkinson's exchange photos sound brilliant. I wish I saw them when Sarah Muir was there. Jody, last but not least.
Thank you. So I guess first and foremost, I'd say to anyone out there who's actually got Parkinson's, do try and go to the World Parkinson Congress if you get the chance. It's obviously expensive. It's obviously, the commitment to travel can be challenging for some people, but it's really worth going. I went to Kyoto in 2019, and it's not an exaggeration to say it changed my life. It took me in a whole new direction in terms of getting involved with Parkinson's, and made me realize that there was an awful lot I could do to help. So it was a life-changing event for me. And I guess what I was interested in 4 years on, so obviously this one was delayed a year because of COVID. It should have been last year in 2022, but it was put back until 2023. But the 2023 Congress in Barcelona, I was interested in what progress had we made in those 4 years. So I guess I'll pull out a number of sort of themes. In terms of the basic science, we touched on this already. Andrew talked a bit about alpha-synuclein. I think there's quite a lot of progress there in understanding the role of alpha-synuclein. There was a really interesting talk by a guy called Per Berghammer from Denmark about this idea that Parkinson's can start in one of two places, either in the gut or in the brain, and slightly different characteristics depending on where it starts. And there's quite a lot of evidence to support that thesis, I think. So that was kind of an interesting talk. So there's certainly progress in terms of understanding the basic science behind Parkinson's, but I felt that it was sort of quite slow progress. I think there's sort of lots of pieces of the jigsaw that are out there, but we don't really understand how they fit together. So I think there's a lot more to do on understanding the basic pathology of the disease. Nevertheless, what I did take away was there's a lot we can do about it, and a lot of progress in terms of therapies. So drug repurposing was a big topic. We talked about one of those already, I think. There's a number of drugs in clinical trials, stage 2 and stage 3 clinical trials now that look really promising. So I think we're likely to see something that will come to market in the next few years on that. So that's really good. What was also interesting is you don't just have to look at disease-modifying therapies or cures for Parkinson's. There's lots of other things you can do as well. So we talked about diet and nutrition already. So the lifestyle aspect, what can I do personally with Parkinson's to make a difference? And I think there was definite progress in that between Kyoto and Barcelona in terms of that being taken more seriously from a scientific perspective, and actually, a lot of research going into that now. And that's really important. I think exercise was always known about, but nutrition is kind of the new hot topic. One thing that was interesting for me was what I'd call technology innovation. So there was a number of companies that had developed devices to help with certain aspects of Parkinson's. So for example, there was an anti-tremor device, a thing that you wear on your wrist, and it actually sort of balances out the tremor so that you can use your hands much more effectively if you're trying to write something, for example, or do something in the kitchen. I thought that was a pretty neat solution. It's based on a gyroscope. And there were other things as well. There was a device to help improve the freezing problem that some people get in the later stages through sending sort of rhythmic pulses in your chest. And there was an augmented reality set that was quite innovative as well, that does a lot of exercise. So lots of technology that wasn't there 4 years ago that's coming to the fore. And I think the other thing is there's obviously things you can do that sort of alternative treatments for Parkinson's. So there was talk about focused ultrasound as a new technique that's showing really good results. That was kind of promising. And the other one was cell replacement therapy, I think has come a long way. And like the drug repurposing, there are several clinical trials in late stages where we're on the cusp of having a viable therapy. So I think in summary, what I took away from the Congress was, basic science, still a bit of a way to go, but actually what can we do about Parkinson's? There's an awful lot of progress I think we're going to see some exciting new therapies in the next few years.
Superb. I think your comment, life-changing event, is really something I heard a lot when I was there. Not just for people with Parkinson's, but even for researchers like me. When I went to Glasgow World Parkinson's Congress, it was life-changing for me because my focus went completely onto Parkinson's in my lab. So if you don't mind, I'm going to turn into a panelist instead of the host because I went to World Parkinson's Congress as well. And I'm just going to mention one session that I was extremely enthused about. So when Andrew was at the debate between Vandenberg and Lashwell, who probably won't be able to see it, but at a simultaneous session, there were cell and gene therapies. So this session was chaired by Roger Barker and Jeff Kortauer. And my lab does work on cell replacement therapies. And 3 speakers were June Takahashi, Christoph Bankowitz, and Malin Palmer. So I was absolutely impressed with the progress that's being made for the cell replacement therapy. And this is a therapy where stem cell-derived neurons are transplanted into the striatum of people with Parkinson's to rebuild the dopaminergic system. So the Kyoto trial is almost done. The Swedish and the UK trial has just started. And what was exciting recently is that Blue Rock announced some positive results of their phase 1 trial. So the cell therapy that they're putting forward in the US is already giving some positive results. But Christoph Bankowitz, he was not speaking about cell therapy, more about gene therapy and the delivery of viruses to the striatum, and including viruses to make GDNF. So his talk blew me away. The amount of engineering and techniques to get the full striatum to get the GDNF looked incredibly exciting. So I think the failure of GDNF trials recently appears to be partly due to lack of delivery. So we couldn't get to all the places of the brain sufficient amounts. And Chris's talk really seemed to be addressing that. So to me, that was really exciting. And the motivating part for me was to see old friends with Parkinson's. So Joe Milne, Gaynor Edwards, YOPD, Vicky Dillon, people with Parkinson's I've known for quite a long time. It was just fantastic to meet them again and see them in person. So to me, it was an incredibly motivating conference. And the last thing I'll mention that really was a very good break was Paul Mayhew Archer's The Funny Side of Parkinson's. So I think everyone was hurting on their guts from laughing. They were crying. It was just an amazing session. So if you ever have a chance to see Paul Mayhew Archer talk about his life with Parkinson's, I strongly encourage it. Okay, I'm going to go through a few questions. Now I see a few here. First one is to Rochelle. What is one of the key research questions you would like to be addressed about and for women with Parkinson's?
Yeah, this is that's a difficult one. But what I would say is the impact of answer the question about the impact of hormones on medication efficacy, and within that, I think is the whole pharmacokinetics by gender of levodopa and other medications that are core used. So we know that some research shows that women may absorb 25% more levodopa than men, and also have a lower amount of the enzyme, I can't think of the name of it now, the COMT inhibitor enzyme. So that means that women get more, distributed to their brain. So I'd love research on that sort of intersection between pharmacodynamics and hormones and symptoms and medication. That's not too much in one.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. I'm going to move to Andrew. Maybe you can see the question in the chat. Essentially, the bottom line is similar, is misfolded opposite caused by underlying upstream processes such as inflammation and mitochondrial dysfunction? And could attacking alpha-synuclein, could this be a red herring as a therapeutic target?
Yeah, so we know that alpha-synuclein does that misfolding process. I mean, what is unclear of, and I think there's a whole point about the fact that it was stuff like a debate happening, is that we don't know what really causes that sort of switch to a toxic form of alpha-synuclein. And then the other aspect is that, as you said, that if you try to target alpha-synuclein, we don't actually know as much about what alpha-synuclein does in healthy, in a healthy context. And I think that's what Jody sort of touches on, that the basic science around that can be quite lacking. And so I think, to even go to the basics, we don't really know as much what alpha-synuclein does healthily. Hence, if you target it, you might actually be causing more side effects, or losing a capacity that we assume to have with alpha-synuclein, and getting rid of all of it, if you consider it as this one same protein, could actually be quite detrimental. And then on that sort of complexity, then at which point some structures might be useful, but then at what point do those structures become bad? So it's hugely complex, and I think I agree with Jody as well that there needs to be a lot of quite basic elucidation as well.
So I'll chip in as well, because I went to a different talk that Hillel gave, not the debate, but one I did attend, and he made a really interesting point and observation that it was the growing of alpha-synuclein structures that were the toxic part, the active growing of them, and not the protein itself. So these oligomers that are thought to be toxic, but the physical sort of increasing size of them is what causes the problems. And the last webinar was a webinar, if anyone wants to look, it's a webinar targeting alpha-synuclein using antibodies. And I think the debate there was quite robust. But the bottom line is that the people working on it very closely are very convinced that reducing alpha-synuclein levels will be beneficial, but getting rid of all of it completely could be a problem. But getting rid of all of it completely would be a very tall order, because there's so much alpha-synuclein in everyone that it might be almost impossible to get rid of all of it. The next question is to Marie. As a result of Emma's talk, do you think all clinical trials should evaluate trial experience from participants to inform future clinical trials?
The short answer to that is yes. I think you should definitely ask participants how they found the trial, what they found challenging and what they didn't find challenging, because it's actually really difficult to recruit to trials and keep people on board in trials. So I think the communication aspect is hugely important, and I think it's also really important to share that. And actually, even before you start a trial, I think definitely you should speak to people with Parkinson's and their family members to really inform how you design your trial. And I've often heard, yes, maybe they don't know enough about what these things actually, like what requests and changes of a trial protocol will actually mean. But actually, the point is not so much that they can enrich to let them to be completely led by that, but to really be sensitive to how the decisions you make influence participant experience through a trial. And I think that is really, really key and important.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I was very pleased to see some posters on this, including one from UCB. UCB are really interested in the participant experience in clinical trials. There's a question for, I think this is maybe for Rochelle, on the diet side. Has there been much discussion on intermittent fasting as a therapeutic intervention for Parkinson's?
Yeah, so there wasn't any specific talks on intermittent fasting. I sort of touched on it in my own talk, and I think there is some interesting research out there, but it's not advanced enough to actually translate into guidelines to tell people with Parkinson's to do intermittent fasting. I suppose one of the things is when you do intermittent fasting, the question is, are you improving symptoms because, like the protein redistribution diet, you're taking food out of the equation, and so your Parkinson's meds work better. But also I do actually think there probably is sort of metabolic processes behind the benefit of intermittent fasting. And I think what I'd like to see is at the next WPC that we actually have specific scientific sessions looking at intermittent fasting, looking at the ketogenic diet, looking at low GI, and actually getting into the devil in the detail around the kind of metabolic processes that, well, I think again it comes back to a bit like the alpha-synuclein, so many different types. I think nutrition is going to be about being personalized to a particular possible, person phenotype of Parkinson's that might respond to. So maybe one that has more mitochondrial involvement might need, specific dietary interventions. So that's where I'd love to see the research and the presentations go at the next WPC.
Great. There's a question, I'm not sure who this could answer this one. Has there been much discussion or research around Makuna as an alternative to symptom suppressing drugs? Does anyone know about Makuna?
Yeah, so basically it's the natural form of levodopa, you could say. It's a bean, a fava bean, and some people with Parkinson's use that, instead of levodopa. Obviously, one of the biggest issues is it doesn't come with carbidopa, but you can combine it with. And there was, I did speak to a gentleman who'd done a poster at the WBC and had some interesting, and has been on it and has found it, because obviously a case of one. There was also another poster about Nucleon, and I think it has to be looked at. I don't think we can ignore it. Obviously, there is this, the safety profile in terms of the types of, these supplements, and also in terms of countries like Africa where they can't get levodopa, that maybe there, needs to be research. One of the posters from Africa sort of said, look, we need to look into research because maybe this is an avenue to get treatment to people who can't get the levodopa medication. So that was the kind of conversations that came up for me around that.
Yeah, great. Maybe Jody, I can give you this one about posters. I'm not sure if I understood the question. What are the posters that a lot of people have talked about from WPC?
So I can't really answer that directly. I don't really know what was popular, but there were an awful lot of posters. There were 2 poster sessions, and I think there was something like 700 or 800 posters in total. So that's kind of a double-edged sword in the sense that there's a lot of research output. I presented a poster and I had people come and talk to me about it. And so there was a lot of research output, a lot of interest. But it's also very hard to sort of visit every poster. And so you had to sort of be quite selective, and the posters are only up for a limited time. So I don't really know the answer, but certainly there's a lot going on. I can say that for sure. Yeah.
This might be from someone who's not attended a World Parkinson's Congress or a scientific congress. Maybe because posters are sort of little snippets of research. They're scientific conference. They're very detailed and lots of data on it. But this Congress had lots of posters from lots of diverse groups and diverse people, including people with Parkinson's. And it's an area where you can go chat about research and meet the person who made the poster. Often you can sometimes see posters online or abstracts, but I'm not sure if they're available. Well, they were available on the app for the World Parkinson's Congress. But if you've never been to a Congress or seen the poster session, I highly encourage you to attend the next Parkinson's Congress. So this is another question for Rochelle. Do you think there are any nutritional approaches that could be disease modifying? Well, that's a tough question.
Yes, I do. And I actually attended a Cure Parkinson's Trust sort of workshop on looking at nutrition as potentially disease modifying, and I think there's lots of areas that we need to explore. Interesting enough, I actually attended the Movement Disorders Congress there recently as well, and there was there was one woman who presented with regard to specific genes. I think it was the pink gene, and noticing that it had mitochondrial impacts, and that perhaps they're doing a study on coenzyme Q10 specifically in that cohort. So I think that's a very, distinct potential of knowing when something can disease modify in a very specific way. So and I actually asked the question there in terms of, we know that maybe people who have the ApoE4 gene in Alzheimer's, that potentially, Mediterranean diet can have a positive effect in. So I think looking at gene interactions with diet and the microbiome, in terms of having disease modifying. So yeah, I think basically we have only scratched the surface. So I think there's plenty to look at there.
Great. A few more comments came in about Makuna. So there's a project being led out of Newcastle and Northumbria, looking at growing Makuna in Africa. And then Joy Milne has put a comment that maybe people can't see, but Richard Walker and Natasha Mishba are now growing mucuna in 6 countries in Africa, and Manchester is part of this effort. So this looks like it is potentially a symptom modifying herbal extract. So that's exciting. And one other thing I wanted to, no one has mentioned Bas Bloom's talk. So I don't know how many people were in Bas Bloom's talk, but for me, that was also a huge highlight. That the idea of doing clinical trials with UPDRS Part 3 as a primary outcome, he totally poo-pooed it. He just said this can't go on anymore, because good drugs are failing because the way that you measure people with Parkinson's is just not adequate. Unacceptable was, I think, the word that he used. And this continuous monitoring and technology and quality of life, he was advocating very strongly. And I think Rochelle also was mentioning self-monitoring. I think that, to me, was a huge theme that I didn't get when I went to Kyoto, is that if clinical trials are to be successful and you can measure signals, that this standard way of measuring them is just not adequate. So Bas Bloom, to me, was a major highlight. I don't know if anyone else was at his talk.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with you. And I think I think what's quite fascinating is that all the people with Parkinson's agree, all the researchers agree, I think the neurologists agree, and we're still using it. So, that's kind of frustrating. But I think a lot of the pharmaceutical companies are trying to develop, digital tools to be able to kind of have markers that are as good as and surpass the PDRS. So the quicker they find that, because I'd be, fearful that basically things that should have gone to the next phase, clinical phase, didn't, because it wasn't sensitive enough, particularly in younger onset or earlier onset with Parkinson's. So yeah, roll on.
Let's see if there's more questions. So question for Andrew, what do you think might be the actual normal function of alpha-synuclein? Do you have any ideas of what alpha-synuclein is doing when it's in a healthy state, for example?
Yeah, so there have been some indications in research, and so there was some interest. There was actually an interesting segment of talks that was actually all about what is the natural role of alpha-synuclein, and it was a really interesting talk that by someone from the German Center of Neurodegenerative Diseases, and it was really interesting because they showed that potentially alpha-synuclein could be there to assist the communications that neurons have with each other by releasing these neurotransmitters. And so there's evidence to show that maybe alpha-synuclein changes its structure because of that, and helps with that. And I think another interesting parallel to that as well, because so I focus as well on what alpha-synuclein potentially does in an innate immune context, whether it could potentially be interacting with the innate immune functions of a neuron, maybe helps protect it. And there's been a lot of evidence so far in terms of epidemiological studies, as well as some animal models to show that maybe if you get rid of alpha-synuclein from, let's say, a mouse, and you give that same mouse a really neurotropic virus, their potential survivability of the mice just completely is really badly affected versus the wild types. So that's all. Maybe that is mechanistically, that's something a lot of people are looking at, and I think that was actually quite a big focus on the conference, especially with the context of COVID as well. So I think talking about the posters, there was a lot of posters on innate immunity and alpha-synuclein in terms of Parkinson's and dementia with Lewy bodies.
Another question, I think, for Rochelle again. I've heard a lot about the Mediterranean diet, but I failed to find an absolute definition of what that encompasses if I want to follow it. So what is the Mediterranean diet?
So I could say it's a healthy diet from the Mediterranean countries, such as, Spain, France, Italy. So basically it is a primarily plant-based diet, based on fruit and vegetables, olive oil, including olives as well, oily fish, salmon, reducing your red meat intake, including lentils or pulses in the diet, and having a good amount of whole grain fiber in the diet. and particularly reducing the amount of sugary, top shelf foods, high saturated foods, and keeping dairy to a moderate amount. And in particular as well, I spoke about, and so did the other speaker in nutrition, about the MIND diet, which is a combination of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet for hypertension. It's specifically, the differences are focusing on the berries, seen as being anti-inflammatory. So that was as a core ingredient of the vegetables, were sort of our two main things, and also they have a smaller amount of sort of dairy foods in the diet. So, but it obviously depends on what country you come from. So really, when people stick to their original, origin diet of their country, their native country, and the healthy version of that tends to be the best diet for Parkinson's wherever you are. But I suppose there are key constituents of those foods, like the berries, the olive oil, the fiber, and that's where we need to get into what are the disease modifying parts of that. But also the research, it seems to be that foods in a dietary pattern have most impact than individual nutrients like just omega-3 or just vitamin D, or it's the combined effect. So I don't know if it's a short version, but
can I comment on that? Because this is the first time I've actually heard someone advocate eat the diet from your region or where you're from, a healthy version of it, right? Because a Mediterranean diet, I assume, is for the people that live in the Mediterranean, but that's a really, really good comment. I really appreciate that. So I wanted to ask you a question. Is there a particular resource that you would point someone with Parkinson's to get an overview of what a great diet would be for someone with Parkinson's? You mentioned Living Well, Running Hard by John Ball, which is a great book for exercise. But if you were to point to a book for diet, what would you point to?
Yeah, I think it's going to be Watch This Space. But in terms of in the interim, Michael J. Fox has a great resource around diet for Parkinson's. So that has a lot of answers to a lot of the questions that have come on. So I would point to there. Parkinson's Europe, I did some interviews for them around diet and Parkinson's, so you can look there. Also in terms of the Parkinson's Foundation, PMD Alliance, a lot of them, when you just search diet and Parkinson's, they do have good resources. But yeah, I will be looking to develop a sort of resource to help people specifically around the Mediterranean diet. So I say, I will keep you posted.
Watch out for your book, you mean?
Well, something that's going to help people, yeah.
So Jody, you have a data science background. How do you see big data or AI impacting on Parkinson's research or Parkinson's clinical trials or Parkinson's treatments?
But obviously there's a role to play in terms of sort of processing large volumes of data. So we're able to collect a lot of data from a lot of people now and actually do something meaningful with that data. I guess it's actually easy to overplay the role of AI. I think there's a lot of need for sort of basic science and sort of just normal interpretation of data. And I think you have to be a bit skeptical about sort of over reading results into data. I guess you can sort of, if you mine data enough, you can kind of end up with any conclusion you like if you try hard enough. So I think it's a case of balancing the technology and using it wisely, but certainly there is a role to processing larger volumes of data.
Great, thank you. Marie, do you want to expand a little bit on the ACT-PD?
Yeah, I can do. So it's basically at the moment it's a consortium within the UK, and we're setting up a large multi-center trial for disease-modifying therapies in Parkinson's. Yeah, we basically at the moment we have a large patient group involved in this, who is involved in every aspect of designing the trial, and also I think at the moment we're thinking, because we are thinking about launching the trial next year, or basically preparing for this. And so we're thinking about communication strategies, and we're actually really interested in the opinion of people. So we've got a wider network that people can be part of, that we tend to sometimes send send short survey questions to, but also maybe invitations to focus group. And yeah, basically at the moment we're really thinking about communication. So this is where it's really important to hear from people with Parkinson's and their care partners. So yeah.
And just to talk about the MAMS. So what is, for people that don't know, what is a MAMS trial and what's special about a MAMS trial? MAMS.
Okay, so it's a multi-arm, multi-stage trial. So that means it has multiple treatments that are tested within the same trial, not on the same person. So basically, you have separate arms for the multiple treatments. They're compared to a control group, and so that gives some efficiencies because instead of running lots of multiple parallel trials where you have to have a placebo group for every single drug that you're testing, this just uses one common placebo group, and so it will need less people. But I think the real innovative bit about this trial is actually that it will include interim checkpoints. So this is the multi-stage bit where we can assess the drugs and see whether there is any sort of sign of them working, and if they don't, they can be replaced. So this is why we call it a platform trial. So so you can use the same structure and the same infrastructure to test drugs continuously. Basically, you can build this. Sometimes there's the analogy of a machine being used. You can build this machine of a trial, which is really a big thing, and you can use it to run lots of different treatments through that machine. And the really nice thing about this is actually you can actually, instead of sort of dismantling your trial, you can use this infrastructure and people will be aware that this trial is happening. So actually in terms of recruitment and retention, this is also really important because you can work on and fine tune this machine as you go on. And I think it will really firstly transform the speed at which we do clinical trials. But I think it will actually also really build on the infrastructure and the communications about trials. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's exciting and accelerating finding new therapies for Parkinson's. I think the MAMS platform, to me, is very, very exciting. Jody, you have a comment?
So I just wanted to make one general comment about the World Parkinson Congress. We've talked an awful lot about science, and obviously science is very important. But there's a lot else going on at the WPC as well that's really important for people with Parkinson's. So there's all sorts of activities. We mentioned the comedy show, which is really important. It's really important to keep a sort of positive attitude when you have something like Parkinson's. But there's lots of things like there was a book club, for example. There were a lot of people talking about different exercise regimes that work for them. There's the nutrition topic. But there's lots of things to do with the Parkinson's community that I think are really important. And so I'd certainly encourage people who are listening not to be put off by the science. There's a lot of other things that are valuable as well at this event.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think the energy at the World Parkinson's Congress is so immense. I think leaving the first opening ceremonies and having those rows of volunteers clapping you through that was incredibly moving. Rochelle, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, just to shout out, someone there was a volunteer and made a comment in the chat. The volunteers make the Congress, you know, and just in terms of, you know, Jody alluded to, it can cost you to go, so you can apply to become a volunteer and then you get, you know, free attendance at the Congress. And there's also a buddy system where you can actually be buddied up. So if you're new to it and you're a bit nervous, that, you know, there's relationships that, you know, have far surpassed the WPC in terms of buddies as well. So I just wanted to say that was, and also for people of young onset, we've really seen that area growing in terms of, you know, young onset being represented, because people are sometimes nervous when they're working about, you know, coming out with Parkinson's. So it's a safe place to get support as well. It's just really unique in terms of the, you know, it's really empowering to see so many people, scientists and neurologists and people working to try and improve our lives. You know, it's a really empowering experience.
I think the safe place was something I heard a lot. So people with Parkinson's said, I feel really at home here. I'm going to have to thank everyone. We're about 30 seconds left. So thank you, Richelle, Jody, Andrew, and Marie. It's been an amazing session. The next World Parkinson's Congress is not announced yet, but it will be announced soon, I think. So keep an eye on it. Strongly encourage anyone with Parkinson's to attend if they can. As Rochelle said, a great way to attend that's cost effective is to be a volunteer, and I think the registration is then free. But I want to thank everyone again for this discussion about the talk of science, but also there's so many interactions that happen around the coffee or even at the bar in the evening that have just really enriched this conference, and it's an extremely special meeting. So I hope to see some of you there at the next World Parkinson's Congress. Thank you and goodbye.